Shalom TV's coverage of the 10th anniversary Limmud conference is made possible in part by a grant from Dr. Naomi Vilko, in honor of her mother, Olga Vilko, and in memory of her father, William Vilko.
The title of today's class is Auschwitz or Sinai, Metaphor and the Meaning of Modern Israel. Auschwitz or Sinai with a question mark is not a rhetorical question. The intention here is not, you have the wrong travel agent. It's actually drawn from an article written by David Hartman of blessed memory in 1983. One of the most significant articles that Rabbi Hartman wrote that connected not only to the big question of Jewish theology, but really to a question of modern Israel, and in particular, trying to address the consciousness of the Jewish people in light of 35 years of the State of Israel. Just to position when and why he wrote this article. He wrote the article in the wake of the Lebanon War, which essentially had rounded up in conclusion in early 1983. And the premise of the article was that the Lebanon War had in many ways symbolized a major transition in Israeli society, which was that unlike the previous wars of 1948, 1956, and 1967, and of course 1973, the Lebanon War signaled a war that did not capture the public imagination as being an existential war. Right? It was not, it may have been at the outset, but ultimately did not appear to be a war that was actually ultimately about Israel's survival. It might have been a war to protect the loss of Israeli life, but it was not an existential war. And so suddenly Israel is fighting in its own consciousness, has moved from fighting a war for its own survival, which by all definitions is what makes a war moral and justified. So number one, there's that shift. And second of all, it was the first war in which there were public stories coming out in the public media that signaled a different type of military atrocity that Israel was being called to attention for. And it's hard to not separate those two things out. In other words, there's obviously a very complicated history of Israeli military behavior in the 1948 war. That's what Ari Shavit's book is now perhaps most famous for, the 56 war, the 67 war, and so on. But in 1982 and 1983, perhaps precisely because it was not viewed by the public as a war of Israel's existential survival, and rather a war that was playing out a need on a northern border, when Israel got into trouble for various episodes related to that war, it rattled the public consciousness about Israel's use of the military and use of power in ways that other wars hadn't done before. The most famous episode of which was the Sabra and Shatila massacre, in which Israeli troops withdrew from the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in South Beirut, and the withdrawal from those refugee camps prompted an entry by Christian phalangists who perpetrated a massacre of men, women, and children in the refugee camp. And it was a really important story in modern Israel of a question of indirect responsibility. Right? It's one thing if your people perpetrate a massacre. It's something else if other people perpetrate a massacre. But what happens when you are initially responsible for the protection of another group of people, you withdraw, and then somebody else perpetrates that massacre? The outcome of the Sabra and Shatila massacre in legal terms was that the Israeli government commissioned the Khan Commission in the Israeli Supreme Court. People know this story. The Khan Commission's result, it's an incredible document in modern Jewish history. The Khan Commission's result was, by legal standards, by Israeli legal standards, and by international legal standards, Israel was in the clear about its own behavior in the war. However, by the standards by which Israel wants to hold itself as a Jewish state, Israel considered itself morally culpable through a theory of indirect responsibility for what happened. The punishment that got issued as a result of the Khan Commission was that Ariel Sharon was stripped of his command and forever banned from being in charge of the army. Now, there's a rabbinic term called kal vachomer. The rabbinic term of kal vachomer is, from, what's the technical Latin term? A fortiori. If you're held responsible for something on a lower claim, you would think you would never be able to do better. It didn't dawn on the commission that they had to make explicit that you can never become prime minister if you can't actually be defense minister and in charge of the army. Very tellingly, since every Israeli politician has 9 lives, when Sharon's career got rehabilitated, he ultimately was able to be prime minister, but he was not allowed to actually take the portfolio of defense minister because he was never allowed to be in charge of the army again. What's interesting is that Sharon at the time refused to accept responsibility and refused to accept the ruling of the Khan Commission. And actually both he and Menachem Begin held out against this ruling, claiming that it was unjust. And it was only after the Peace Now activist was killed by a bombing in Jerusalem, in a rally, a Peace Now rally, that the public opinion went so far against Begin and Sharon that he had to kind of concede the point and actually step down. In light of this, in light of these tensions in Israeli society that had never been seen before about power and the use of the military, and in light of the fact that the Lebanon War was not perceived as being an existential war, David Hartman wrote a piece called Auschwitz or Sinai, in which he called out, asking the central question of what the state of Israel was supposed to be about, right? On the theory of what are Auschwitz and Sinai as metaphors. The Auschwitz metaphor is we are perpetually on the defensive. We are constantly fighting for our own survival. We are perpetual victims. And that animates a certain type of moral behavior, which is entirely premised on the moral legitimacy of survival. In other words, an Auschwitz ideology for a state is survival at all costs. Sinai, in contrast, in David's metaphor, and obviously when you say Auschwitz or Sinai, you are predisposed to Sinai. Sinai in that metaphor means to convey the aspirational desire of the Jewish people to live under certain conditions of sovereignty in which we were calling ourselves to be ultimately responsible to a higher degree of moral behavior. Right? Sinai, very tellingly, and David writes about this also in A Living Covenant, one of his other books, the Torah is given to the Israelites as a covenant, the constitution for them to live in the land of Israel, and it's given to them in Sinai before they actually get there. As if to convey, I'm giving you this Torah not to make you feel that you've arrived and to give you some sense that this is a holy land permanently. What I'm doing is I'm saying to you, this is the document by which you are supposed to live by when you actually arrive under sovereignty. So your whole operative notion of what Sinai is supposed to mean for the Jewish people under sovereignty is that you are constantly being challenged to do better and to live up to the best of your moral aspirations. David wrote this piece in 1983, and it was, for those who read it, for the world in which he occupied and folks who came into the orbit, a very significant moment of what was called cheshbon hanefesh, right? A kind of an examining of our soul, a reflection on who are we as a society and what do we want to be. If we fast forward 30 years later, and I started working on this material last year when at the Hartman Institute, in light of Rabbi Hartman's passing, we devoted our summer in our rabbis program and with our lay leaders to reflecting on the legacy of David Hartman. And each of us took a classic writing or a piece of his theology and tried to unpack it and try to figure out what have we learned from it and what have we learned since. Fast forward 30 years later, and this tension on Auschwitz or Sinai has not only not been resolved, but in some ways has become much more profound in light of Israeli contemporary political attitudes, as well as American Jewish attitudes of how we're supposed to be in relationship to the state of Israel. Example number one is there has never been a prime minister more focused on Auschwitz than Prime Minister Netanyahu. I want to be clear, that's not a partisan political statement. I think Netanyahu would actually take pride in it. One of the most famous pieces of Netanyahu's rhetoric over and over again, I want to be clear, he mostly does this to the American Jewish community. So I want us to think about what the implications are that. He says it much less in Israel than he does to conferences of American Jews. But one of the most familiar pieces of his rhetoric is the sentence, it is 1939 and Iran is Germany. Now, since he's the son of a historian, he sometimes says it's 1933 and Iran is Germany, and he sometimes says it's 1938 and Iran is Germany, and he sometimes says it's 1939 and Iran is Germany. Because if you actually know your history, there's a difference in the international community's response to the rise of Germany, of where we were in 1933 and had we acted a certain way, what would have been preventable, than it is to 1938 and 1939. But the motivating attitude, the reason why you would give a speech, primarily to American Jews, but sometimes to Israelis as well, that perpetually calls on the narrative of Hitler, Germany, and Auschwitz, the constant move is to animate a certain political set of behaviors. In this case, it's to catalyze the world towards a military response to Iran. But in some ways, more importantly, it is to focus the moral energy of what it is that we think has to be the primary focus of the State of Israel on the legitimacy of Jewish survival. If you dislike it or you disagree, you call it a diversion tactic. But from its own motivations, it is to focus our primary responsibility as the leaders or custodians of a Jewish state is to preserve and protect this Jewish state from a catastrophe from ever befalling us the way it has befallen us before. And so what happens is this very tension about thinking about the State of Israel solely from a defensive and protective place versus thinking about the State of Israel as something that it's never fully living up to is starting to pull apart the Jewish people. Right? We could name names if we wanted to, but as I said, we're on Shalom TV and I won't. We could name names about the Jewish organizations in America and the Jewish organizations in Israel that are motivated by an Auschwitz narrative. Right? Our primary responsibility as Jews, as community, as Zionists, is to preserve and protect the State of Israel at all costs. And so it creates no moral obligation to be part of making the State of Israel great. Your primary moral responsibility is preserving and protecting the State of Israel, that it not be destroyed. And there are others, a mounting sensibility, I think probably in the American Jewish community more than in Israel, of the Sinai mode, which is, unless it's perfect or unless we're in an aspirational space, I don't want to be in relationship to the State of Israel. Right? Sinai is a setup for the perfect is the enemy of the good. Right? I talked about this yesterday in the context of anti-Zionism. Right? If you talk constantly about the State of Israel as an aspirational story that the Jewish people want to have, and if it's not living up to that, it's easy to back away. And so these two poles, being from the Auschwitz protective mode of the Sinai aspirational mode, are actually in some ways at odds with each other, and they tell two different stories about what it means to be as Jews in relationship to the State of Israel. And partly because we are a people of metaphor and memory and meaning, it's critical for us to understand not only what is the State of Israel politically and what's its history, but it's how do we fit our understanding of the State of Israel into an overarching meta or mythic narrative, because that's what we do as a Jewish people. We have important stories, and we plug our political realities into our important stories because that's how we give them meaning. So what I wanted to do, and I'm going to do it quickly, and then we'll have a little discussion, is sketch out where I think we are. Right? What do we mean when we talk really about this metaphor of Auschwitz as a deeply rooted piece of the Jewish consciousness? What do we mean by the metaphor of Sinai? And here's what I want to push against what David Hartman did in 1982, respectfully, and to say, actually, neither of them really works, or the inverse, actually, you need both of them. In other words, a deep and healthy Jewish consciousness has to both entail a deep memory of Jewish victimization and victimhood, but not as a kind of moral get-out-of-jail-free card. It has to be cushioned and cautioned with a sense that our mission as the Jewish people in terms of the State of Israel has to be about the state we are meant to have, and not merely the state that we have as a vehicle of self-protection and self-preservation. And that too also has to be cushioned by the Jewish a notion of Jewish victimhood. So I'm going to kind of go quickly through some of the sources here. We won't do all of them. I want to share a few ideas of how this works and then take the last bit for some questions and discussion. The first idea is, what do we mean by Auschwitz? The exemplar text of Auschwitz as a consciousness that kind of defines a Jewish ideology of nationhood is spelled out by Rashi in the book of Genesis, 33:4, second source, on the basis of a moment of confrontation, a classic moment of confrontation between the imagined us and the imagined other. The ultimate exemplars of this are Jacob and Esau, right? If we had longer time, we'd talk about how Jacob is one of the most difficult characters to like in the Torah. And at the same time, he's our ancestor and the first person to be called by the name Yisrael. Right? He betrays his brother. He does all this stuff in their childhood. And then, as he's gotten powerful and his brother's gotten powerful, they're about to reconfront each other. They're about to meet in this big embrace. And Jacob is scared about what Esau is going to do to him, and possibly Esau is scared about what Jacob's going to do to him. And remember, remember the Bible, they're sending messengers in front of each other, and they're setting up the alignment of what the camps should look like, and they're about to be in this encounter. And then kind of the climactic moment is that they rush at each other. And as it says in Genesis 33:4, Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Right? It actually deflates all of this tension about what this encounter was about to be. Nevertheless, the Midrash surfaces how are we meant to interpret this kiss. And the rabbis say as follows, because there's actually almost like a typo in the biblical text, that there's dots over the word, and rabbis love little things like that. It's like where you hinge your idea that there's something there that it's not fully telling you. So it says, some interpret the dots to mean that he did not kiss him wholeheartedly. You think the fact that Esau kissed Jacob signaled the fact that they had been reconciled? Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai said, I'm going to change one key letter in this, what's here. It is a well-known tradition that Esau hates Jacob. Esav soneh Yaakov, but that his compassion moved him at that time and he kissed him wholeheartedly. You think the fact that he kissed him meant that all was reconciled? Actually, the normative idea that Jews are supposed to remember at every given moment is Esav soneh Yaakov. And it's in present tense, it's not past tense. Esau hates Jacob. The phrase Esau hates Jacob has become part of a Jewish ideology that, if you're not familiar with it, I could find you Jews who are. This belief that at the end of the day, Esau, i.e. all others, but primarily those who we imagine as our political enemies, who are in essence also connected to us, they always hate us. So even if at various times they treat us nicely, don't let that undermine what their real intentions are, which are to actually defeat us and undermine us. Right? So any peace encounter, any attempt to make peace with a sworn enemy is, they're shaking our hands, but they really are holding a dagger behind their back. And they're just waiting for an opportunity to do something to us. What this means is that if you are thinking of Jacob as the ancestor, the archetype of the Jewish people, that your interlocutors, the goyim, whatever goyim you want to use to fill in that blank, are always in some ways out to get you. And your primary instinct must be to always be cautious of their motives in those particular moments. The corollary to this in the book of Numbers is, what do we imagine at the end of the day when we actually have a nation and we actually have a state? What vision do we have of how that nation fits into the family of nations? And one of the more depressing visions that's actually in the book of Numbers, which is supposed to be a blessing but is actually in essence its own curse, is when Bilam, the prophet, is trying to curse the people of Israel. Right? And God gets into his business and makes a turn around, and everything he says is actually blessing the people of Israel. As part of that blessing, he says something very telling, which describes what, from the Bible's perspective, is a vision of what the Jewish nation is supposed to be in the world, but from our perspective is actually a dark indicator of a kind of consciousness that I think we have to be alarmed about, which is what? Bilam takes up his discourse, and he says in verse 8, "How shall I curse who God has not cursed? How shall I defy he whom the Lord has not defied? For from the top of the rocks I see him, and from the hills I behold him. Lo, the people shall live alone and not be reckoned among the nations. Am levadad yishkon." The vision, this incredible blessing that we think that Bilam is offering to the Jewish people, is actually a blessing of existential loneliness from the family of nations. If we go back to kind of the great Zionist debates about, are we supposed to be a nation like all other nations, or are we supposed to be exceptional? This takes the stance of a kind of exceptionalism of total alienation from the family of nations. It's a depressing vision of what the Jewish people are supposed to be. It's rooted, again, in a sense of we are surrounded by enemies on all sides. right? We must be fearful of all of that they're going to do to perpetrate against us. Even if they act peacefully towards us, they're actually threatening to do something to us. And so even when we fantasize about the state that we want, to use this language from Numbers, even when we're imagining what we actually want in the end of days, the metaphor that we wind up choosing is one of existential loneliness. This becomes, and I know I'm exporting from ancient text to modern ideology, but I want to say this phrase, Esav Sonel Yaakov, is part of a Jewish ideology that is out there, and I think informs in really serious ways, even just as metaphor, what it means when we talk about a crisis or Auschwitz or victimhood-governed ideology with respect to the state of Israel. If our primary focus is self-preservation, then that becomes, it's such a strong moral impetus. And in light of the Holocaust, we understand why. It becomes such a powerful moral impetus that the issue becomes survival at all costs. On a different day, we might explore how this actually is in some ways the normative ideology of Ariel Sharon, in ways that I think Sharon was conscious of and unapologetic about. Right? There was a massacre in Kibbutz in the early 1950s. And there was, as a result, a vicious response by the Israeli defense forces that went in and over-punished for the fact that a terrorist had come out of the town of Kibbutz. And Sharon, in his memoir, says, essentially, we did this to send a message that we weren't to be trifled with. He acknowledges that from a moral perspective on the laws of military ethics, he had no foot to stand on. But from we had better make sure our responsibility in this era, in this generation, 8 years after Auschwitz, was to ensure the dignity of Jewish blood will not be made forfeit once again. Right? That is a claim that defines a political ideology to the present. It defines in a huge way American Jewish philanthropic interests, are heavily animated by the passion for Jewish survival, and as a result, don't tell me anything about what the state of Israel does wrong. I don't really care. My primary responsibility is to make sure that the state of Israel and the Jewish people are protected. That's one ideology that actually animates contemporary Zionism. The flip ideology, as I mentioned before, is the ideology of Sinai. And here you get the most famous text to this effect is right when the Jewish people have gotten to the foot of Mount Sinai, and right as they're about to receive the Torah, God describes who they are supposed to be in the world, saying famously, "You've seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I carried you on eagle's wings," I'm on page 5 of the handout, "and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasure among the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you should tell to the people of Israel." Classically, it's the text about Jewish chosenness, but it's really a text about Jewish purposefulness. It's making the Jewish people, and they're about to enter the land of Israel, but for a delay of about 40 years because of some transgressions. As they're about to enter into the land of Israel, they're made into a purposeful vessel, because what, after all, is a kingdom of priests? But the priests are exactly the people in the land of Israel who don't actually get the right of land ownership. If you are a people made up of priests, what you're being told is you are in a land only as the representatives of God's purpose on earth, and not because I've actually given you this land to act as though it's your means of protection. You can almost hear the conditional clause here. If you live up to what you're supposed to do, you get a state like all the other states. If you don't live up to what you're supposed to do, if you're not rooted by a message of aspiration, all the earth is mine. I haven't given this to you. I've leased it to you on condition of good behavior. Right? This is a totally different imaginative sensibility about what Jewish sovereignty is supposed to be about. Right? Ultimately, it is about an obligation or responsibility to do something exceptional for the world, where if we don't actually do that, there's no reason whatsoever to have a Jewish state. In some ways, it goes exactly opposite to an Auschwitz sensibility, which says the primary reason to have a Jewish state is preservation of the Jews. And the counter-narrative says preservation of the Jews on its own right is not a moral category. We have other texts that articulate it, but the one contemporary Israeli politician, since I singled out Netanyahu as the exemplar on one side, what I think of the representative in the Israeli political discourse of the Sinai vision for the state of Israel is Ruth Calderon. If you haven't watched the Ruth Calderon video of her speech, inaugural speech in the Knesset, turn this off and put that on instead. It's an incredible moment of a woman who calls herself secular, but that's just for a paucity of language. She's a very learned Talmud scholar who, by virtue of her public intellectual leadership, got swept into office in Israel a couple of years ago as part of the Yesh Atid revolution in Israel, which signaled a kind of desire by the Israeli electorate to be enough with the Auschwitz story as the means by which we define our political process. For years in the state of Israel, politicians would say things like, as soon as we dispense with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we'll deal with all of the social issues that are tearing apart this country, religion and state, economics, and so on. And then, although the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is far from being resolved, the Israeli electorate said, okay, if we don't wrestle with those big existential issues about what our society is going to look like, it's almost not worth resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, it's the kind of the message of the Yesh Atid revolution. And in one fell swoop, Yesh Atid became the second largest party in the Knesset, dominated primarily by characters who have no business in the Knesset. Right? Many of them are doing great things, but they don't have any of the kind of political pedigree that would get them there. Folks like Rabbi Dov Lippman, who's an American-born Orthodox rabbi who calls himself Haredi because it's politically useful to be Haredi, but he's actually really an American Orthodox rabbi who actually identifies with ideas about Jewish pluralism, who spent the bulk of his first few months in the Knesset working on legislation to ban foie gras. Right? Because on his argument, it's a Sinai argument. If a Sinai argument, a Jewish state can't be perpetuating these kind of unethical behavior towards animals. A kind of total dislodging of the sensibility that Israeli public leadership is only about whether we protect and defend the state of Israel this way or that way, and more on the question of what state do we actually want. So famously, Calderon gave this speech in the Knesset, which he taught Talmud, and this is secular woman teaching Talmud. She gets interrupted by an ultra-Orthodox speaker of the Knesset, but not to tell her, it was amazing, not to tell her stop teaching Talmud, but to say, I think you're reading the passage wrong, and they argue with each other. It was like, and ironically, he actually validated her as a speaker and reader of text in the state of Israel. And she says in her speech at the Knesset, I aspire to bring about a situation in which Torah study is the heritage of all Israel, in which the Torah is accessible to all who wish to study it, in which all young citizens of Israel take part in Torah study, as well as military and civil service. Together, we will build this home and avoid disappointment. Right? What she's essentially saying is Torah is the legacy of the national character of the Jewish people. The reason we have a Jewish state is to be able to be the people of Torah. She's not saying this as a Haredi member of Knesset, she's saying it as a ostensibly secular member of Knesset, and it is rooted in this Sinai ideology. We have a state in order to do something. Let's take these as two poles of this story, right? An ideology motivated by defensive and protective, an ideology motivated by aspirations of what we mean to do. I want to offer, though, however, even if these work as the basic frameworks, in some sense, neither work. And the reason that neither really works is, on one hand, although Sinai is a beautiful story, one of the corollaries is when you read after Exodus 19, is that it turns out that Sinai is terrifying and inaccessible. Right? Remember how the revelation of Sinai is meant to happen? The people think that they're supposed to go up in the mountain to receive the Torah, and they become so scared that God says, no, just leave them down there and you and I will talk. And then immediately after the Sinai revelation, the people realize that they are so far removed from this aspirational vision of what the Jewish state is supposed to be that their first action is rebellion against God and a transgression. Right? All of the story of Sinai that follows the actual revelation at Sinai seems to work against the notion that that's the model of what the Jewish state is supposed to be. Everybody following that? The problematic of Sinai is Sinai itself. It's the ultimate perfect is the enemy of the good. I tell this magic story of a commitment that the Jewish people are making, and it turns out nobody can actually live up to it. Right? Part of the reason we see a drift in Jewish communal life against the state of Israel and away from the state of Israel is because we oversold the story of the state of Israel to the Jewish people in the last 65 years as like the way in which all our dreams were going to come true. And it turns out some things it's good at and some things it's not. In other words, when the story of the relationship of the Jewish people to the state of Israel is through this aspirational language, it creates the problem of what happens when it's not as good as it hopes to be. And Auschwitz in and of itself is also a failed story, right? It's insufficient alone to do this because, as we see in both in the Talmud and in the Maimonides, let's read quickly this passage in Talmud from on page 8. Rabbi Yehuda said, citing Rav, "Whoever indulges in grief to excess over his dead will weep for another." Let me read that again. "Whoever indulges in grief to excess over his dead will weep from another." One of the ideologies of suffering that this is one of the most devastating Gemarot you'll ever see. I want to encourage you, those of you who work in any sort of pastoral settings, forget you learned this Gemara. Never use it. It's only useful as a metaphor for the Jewish people. It's not really useful as a metaphor for counseling those who are in suffering. The Gemara goes on to say there was a certain woman who lived in the neighborhood of Rav Huna. She had 7 sons, one of whom died, and she wept for him too much. Right? Lo aleinu. Rav Huna sent word to her saying, "Don't act this way. Stop it. Stop mourning so much." She heeded him not, and he sent to her, "If you heed my word, it is well, but if not, are you anxious to make provision for another?" What's he saying to her? If you keep mourning over your loss of life, are you ready to mourn for another dead child? The next son died, and they all died. In the end, he said to her, "Are you making provisions for yourself yet?" And she died too. It's like the least redemptive story in the history of the world, right? Why do we tell a story like this? Let's extrapolate from the particular of this context of a narrative story about an individual with death. Perhaps to suggest, Rav Huna is saying, is if your life is obsessed with death, you are not living. If the Jewish people's story, and this is how I'm extrapolating it from this moment, the idea of this, if the Jewish people's sole motivation is to combat the death of the previous generation with an obsession with the death of the previous generation, it actually forfeits its own sensibility of what it actually is about and what it is living for. So I say I can't relate to this text as a text about the loss of a child. Can't. It's like unreadable, and it's horrific, right? But as a metaphor for what it means when a person forfeits their life because they're so obsessed with loss, then you almost become, well, what are you about anymore? One of the things I think is happening in a generational divide between one generation that grew up with 4867 and Entebbe, that lived through the possibility of mass death, and in some cases lived through the mass death, right? So the grandparents' generation lived through the Holocaust and is committed because of the Holocaust to do everything nothing the state of Israel can do wrong, which will wrench them away from a narrative of what it means to protect and defend the Jewish people. The generation that perhaps came second heard those stories from their parents and then lived through moments like 4867 and Entebbe of great Jewish heroism in the face of the possible loss of Jewish life. People forget that before 67, they were digging mass graves in public parks in Israel out of the fear that this was going to be a genocidal wipeout. So the fact that the state of Israel was heroic in those moments affirmed a sensibility of what do we need to do to prevent a great loss of life. Our generation, let's say my generation of American Jews, looks askance at a notion that Jewishness is supposed to be predicated entirely on survival or not death, and starts to ask, as I'm doing today, if we are a cult of death, what are we doing here? Right? The obsession with that narrative as meaning to animate what Jewish sovereignty is about actually undermines the notion that sovereignty is supposed to be about something. Maimonides makes this into halacha about how long you're actually supposed to eulogize somebody. And in fact, goes on halacha 12, and this is the clearest articulation. A person should not become excessively brokenhearted because of a person's death. As Jeremiah says, do not weep for a dead man and do not shake your head because of him. That means not to weep excessively, for death is the pattern of the world. And this is great Maimonides in classic form. and a person who causes himself grief because of the pattern of the world is a fool. Right? You think that what you're supposed to do is become so obsessed with death and loss, when in fact death and loss are the way of the world. Rambam is basically saying, get over it. That's not why it is that you live. What I want to do for the last 5 minutes is try to see how do we hold these two in tension with one another. What would a healthy Jewish ethic, us as the Jewish people, us at least as a small subsection or case study of the Jewish people, to hold in productive tension both a consciousness that we have been victims throughout our history, we've been victims very much in our recent history, and there's a profound need for vigilance for the Jewish people, for our survival, that the state of Israel comes to help us do. And at the same time, hold in tension with that the moral responsibility to not let the entirety of the state of Israel be dictated by the moral legitimacy that comes out of survival. It cannot simply be the sufficient story that we tell ourselves as a Jewish people of what the state of Israel was meant to be. And to think then, how does that implicate? How does it implicate public policy and practice to both be conscious and protective of Jewish blood and be similarly motivated that that is not the reason for the meaning of the state of Israel? To this, I want to look at a couple of sources that tell the story. Let's look at Babylonian Talmud Tractate Baba Batra 60b. We're looking at the second paragraph where it says, our rabbis taught. Our rabbis taught, when the temple was destroyed for the second time, large numbers of people in Israel became ascetics, binding themselves neither to eat meat or drink wine. Right? This is a predictable response in the wake of catastrophe and suffering, is to say, why should I go on living? Right? In this case, not only are they going to say, why should I go on living, but they say, why should I hold on to any of the elements that I previously lived with if all of those have become routed with this sense of loss? Everything I see is Holocaust. Right? Everything I see, and therefore I almost want to retreat and withdraw from the world. Rabbi Joshua got into a conversation with them and said to them, my children, why do you not eat meat or drink wine? They replied, shall we eat meat which used to be brought as an offering on the altar, now that the altar is in abeyance? Shall we drink wine which used to be poured as a libation on the altar, but is no longer? What's their argument? Wine, our whole purpose was connected to the temple as a people. We shouldn't do any of these things whatsoever. And he says to them, he will ultimately play out the reductio ad absurdum, right? The silliness of this argument. He says, if that's so, we shouldn't eat bread either, because the meal offerings have ceased. And they said, we'll eat fruit. I like that line. We'll just have fruit. I'm not that hungry anyway. We should not eat fruit, he said, because there's no longer an offering of first fruits. They said, okay, well, we'll eat other fruits that are not connected to the first fruits. And he said, but then you shouldn't drink water because there's no longer a ceremony of the water drawing. And to this, they could find no answer. So they says to them, and here we find one of the most cleanly articulated theologies of how to hold suffering and loss in proper balance with actually going on to live your life. He says, my sons, come and listen to me. Not to mourn at all is impossible because the blow has fallen. In other words, to pretend that nothing actually happened to us is its own kind of perversity. Right? The quickness with which we forget the catastrophes and victimizations to which we've been held is its own type of perversion. However, to mourn overmuch is also impossible because we do not impose on the community a hardship which the majority cannot endure. It's an amazing little twist. If you create a system that people actually can't live under, the long-term repercussions of that system that you built is that people will just leave. I want to say something a little bit, I was just going to say off the record, but it's not. This indictment is a very, very 2014 indictment of the ways in which we have overplayed Jewish victimization, right, and Jewish suffering in ways that are actually pushing people out of the community. If to be Jewish today is about holding on to the memory of the Holocaust entirely for its own sake, it actually is this. It's a burden that is too hard on the community, that the community is not able to absorb. And it requires, as the rabbis will do next, trying to locate memory of victimization in proper contexts in which it is neither too much nor not enough. And the example they give as follows, the sages therefore said, skip ahead a line, a person should stucco his house but leave a little bit bare. And then because they're rabbis, they ask you how much. It doesn't matter. A person should prepare a full-course banquet, but leave out an item or two. A woman can put on all her ornaments, but leave off one or two. For so it says, if I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand be forgotten. In the last line it says, whoever mourns for Zion shall be privileged to behold her joy. In other words, you actually have to have minor, small-scale rituals of mourning if you're actually going to wind up seeing the redemption, because it's the means by which you hold on to your story. But if you become overburdened with memory and victimization, you actually distance people from the community itself. And what are these little rituals? Ultimately, the best version of this, the one that people know the most, is break a glass, or in our parlance, usually a light bulb, under a chuppah, as a marker not of timing the clap for l'chaim, which is what basically Mazel Tov is what it becomes, but as a means of actually destroying something of value at the moment of your celebration to indicate that no celebration can be complete. Put differently, what the rabbis are basically saying is, in order to preserve suffering as part of your consciousness, you actually have to make it banal. You have to find little markers of suffering, little acknowledgments, and then the rest of your life you should live without being obsessed with that suffering. I want to offer some closing remarks about what are the ways in which what are the ways in which this might happen. In other words, what might it mean for the Jewish people to both be conscious of the overplay of a victimization narrative and what that does to us, and also very conscious of the overplay of an aspirational story and what it does to the state of Israel. Why neither of those tells the full story and what it means to hold them in tension. But the last text I want to look at before opening up for some discussion is this incredible little passage by Amos Oz on page 15. Those of you who were at the anti-Zionism session, I alluded to this yesterday, but it's still a worthwhile read on its own front because he integrates, I think very powerfully, how victimization and the memory of the Holocaust should animate a consciousness about the meaning and legitimacy of the state of Israel, but why it's not sufficient. He says as follows. This is the place to make my first shocking confession. Part of the reason I also like doing this, he wrote it exactly the same time as Auschwitz or Sinai. It's written, I think, in 1982 or 1983 in a book called Po V'Sham Be'eretz Yisrael, where Amos Oz went around and talked to Israelis in the land of Israel. And it's translated in English as In the Land of Israel. And it is still, I think, one of the best books on modern Israel in terms of teasing out the various different ideologies of the state. He says as follows, this is the place to make my first shocking confession. Others will follow. I think that the nation state is a tool, an instrument, that is necessary for a return to Zion, but I am not enamored of this instrument. The idea of the nation state is, in my eyes, goyim nachas, a Gentile's delight. You hear that? Goyim nachas. A state is not, we're not a people of of this stuff. We're a people of Sinai. What do we need like the mechanisms of a modern state? I would be more than happy to live in a world composed of dozens of civilizations, each developing in accordance with its own internal rhythm, all cross-pollinating one another without anyone emerging as a nation-state. No flag, no emblem, no passport, no anthem, no nothing. Only spiritual civilizations tied somehow to their lands without the tools of statehood and without the instruments of war. Right? Wouldn't it be great if we, the people of ideas, and the people of the book could be the exemplars for the rest of the world of what we're meant to be. A lofty civilization that doesn't need to be burdened by the obligations of taking out the trash. But the Jewish people has already staged a long-running one-man show of that sort. The international audience sometimes applauded, sometimes threw stones, and occasionally slaughtered the actor. No one joined us. No one copied the model the Jews were forced to sustain for 2,000 years, the model of a civilization without the tools of statehood. For me, this drama ended with the murder of Europe's Jews by Hitler. And I am forced to take it upon myself to play the game of nations with all the tools of statehood, even though it causes me to feel, as George Steiner put it, like an old man in a kindergarten. It's an incredible metaphor, right? This sense that we as the Jewish people are a people of Sinai, forced to play as not as much of a Sinai game as we would like to, because the rules of the game dictate, and our own historical experience of victimhood requires a sensibility that this is how you, in order to do Sinai, you have to have a consciousness of your own victimhood and victimization. You can't just pretend that we'll be the aspirational nation state and that will be sufficient. To play the game with an emblem and a flag and a passport and an army, and even war, provided that such war is an absolute existential necessity. I accept those rules of the game because existence, there's a typo here, I'm sorry, it's going to be disappointing, because existence without the tools of statehood is a matter of mortal danger. I know, I told you, it's going to be disappointing. Existence without the tools of statehood actually is a mortal danger, but I accept them only until this point. To take pride in the tools of statehood, to worship these toys, to crow about them, not I. If we must maintain these tools, including the instruments of death, it must be not only with glee, but with wisdom as well. I would say with no glee at all, only with wisdom and with caution. Nationalism itself is, in my eyes, the curse of mankind. This is a pretty devastating piece by Amos Oz. But he puts in, not everybody relates to the full extent of the nationalist critique that he's offering. But what he's essentially doing is you can never allow the mechanisms that are built around self-protection, self-preservation, and victimhood to define the totality of what it meant to be as a Jewish people in building our own nation state. The more you become obsessed with your victimization, the less you actually feel purposeful in what that state is supposed to be. Much as the more obsessed you are with the notion of just being the Sinai state, you lose some capacity to have the type of historical memory that animates the need to preserve that state even when it's not doing everything it should. These are tensions that I would suggest are pulling apart the community. Right? We have those who are totally on the side, overwhelmingly, of the Jewish victimhood experience has been so devastating and so profound that there is nothing the state of Israel can do that's going to sever our relationship from it. The equal energy that is emerging in the community, I would say both among Americans and Israelis, is the state of Israel is only good to the extent that it does what it was supposed to do for the Jewish people in the world. And the passage of time from the era of Jewish victimization is such that that's gaining steam. Right? The idea that if the state of Israel is great, I'm with it. If the state of Israel is failing, I'm not. Neither of those stories is sufficient. I want to say the Holocaust crisis story for the Jewish people is not going to be the long-standing story for the Jewish people of the meaning of the state of Israel. It's not. It worked for a long time. It raised an enormous amount of money. Right? It will continue to work as long as there are philanthropists alive who are motivated by that crisis story. But at the same time that we think that by paying the bills now, on the basis of that story, we're keeping the story going, the more that story gets pushed out as the dominant story of the meaning of Israel, the more other Jews are actually turned off by it. If you're motivated, though, however, entirely by the notion of the meaning of the state of Israel as being about the perfection or the aspiration of the state of Israel, it's very easy to forget how challenging it is to actually put together a state, and it's very easy to forget what the alternatives have been for the Jewish people in Jewish history. For further reading, right, you can look at a couple of the other sources that I put in this both section of the way in which our tradition imagines that the same ideas of Jewish victimization are both used to talk about what people you should be and also your moral responsibilities to the people who you rule. One of the quick things that people forget is the same, for you are a stranger in the land of Egypt, the same idea is used by those who are trying to protect and preserve the Jewish people as those who are trying to make Jews responsible for others. Right? There's this great divide emerging also in the Jewish community between those who would interpret the history of Jewish victimhood as an obligation to protect the Jewish people versus those who take the story of Jewish victimhood as a moral obligation of Jews to help others. In all of our texts, those are actually the same thing. Being self-conscious of your own preservation and using that mechanism to build a model aspirational state are thought to be the same thing. My goal is how do we figure out, as a community, a way to hold this productive tension? Questions and comments? Yeah.
I think it's extremely unfair to confound your analysis about the past, which I take it to be absolutely correct. One cannot focus on mourning forever.
Yeah.
But if someone is at your gate threatening to kill you, you better focus on that today.
So you know the saying, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're out to get you. Doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Sorry, I botched that. I would take the reverse of it as true also. Just because they're out to get you doesn't mean that that's the entirety of the ideology that you use to govern your system. That's what I would say. All right, if we're willing to concede that there's a pluralism of reasonably held views around what the state of Israel should do in response to what it perceives as its existential threat, which I believe, then we're on the same page. And you say that shouldn't be the dominant normative ideology about the meaning of the state of Israel. But the ace in the hole here is over and over, Netanyahu comes to America, because this is not actually about Israelis, it's about American Jews. Netanyahu comes to America, and the speech he gives to motivate American Jews in their relationship to Israel is an Iran-Germany speech. Now, what's actually, no, one second. The reverse is, when Obama went to Cairo and talked about the Jewish people's historical suffering in the Holocaust as implicitly one of the motivators, the primary reason for the validity of the state of Israel, Israelis were scandalized. They were furious. What do you mean? Why weren't you telling the story of of Zionism and what the society they were trying to build and the Jewish historical longings for the land of Israel? What it suggested was there's even a divide within the Jewish people of the extent to which we want the dominant story that we hear about the state of Israel to be one of victimization. So even there, it suggests that it's not such a clean line, and that we as an American Jewish community may need to catch up a little bit with Israelis about the ways we overplay victim language as the means for animating relationship to and support of the state of Israel. Thanks. Yes?
On a totally different, maybe more radical notion, is perhaps the ideal to not have a land at all, but for the Jewish people to be so cohesive as the Kohanim were, that we would be able to live amongst the other nations and be truly a people of ideas. I'm certainly not making it and saying there should be no state of Israel. I just want to make that clear.
Yeah. So it is a radical argument. The theological roots of anti-Zionism are actually in some ways born out of the notion that in one reading, Judaism changed. And ultimately we were supposed to be delivering this message more broadly, or being the people of books and ideas more than we were the people of sovereignty. I guess one way to think about that tension is even in the question of when we actually got a temple, did it mean that the land of Israel was invested with holiness permanently or only temporarily? That was a great classic rabbinic debate, right? When the fact that there was a temple and God's presence came to the land of Israel, did that mean forevermore the land has been invested with holiness, which would suggest that once that happens, you can't go back, counter to your argument. Whereas the counter view might say, actually, it's only holy to the extent that you bring about God's presence on earth. And if your state is failing to bring about God's presence, as Haredi anti-Zionism argues, right, not only are you not doing what you think you're doing, right, but you're actually bringing out a perversion of God's name because you're pretending to do something that's not there. Yes?
We in the United States have done a really bad job at promoting the positive and other elements of peoplehood. But at the same time, I'm troubled by the notion that the Jewish state needs to have tags and reasons to exist apart from the national aspirations of the Jewish people. That somehow, in particular, the aspirational Sinai metaphor, the world agrees. We should be held to Israel should be held to a different standard, and the world does it all the time. Why exactly do we? That has its downsides.
You know why? Because we're Jewish. No, actually the reason why is because we are a people who take seriously the things that we do and the commitments we want to make in the world. We don't want to be a people who basically says we just want to. If you wanted to make that argument, then say, look, just assimilate. We have an opportunity. Then, the window of opportunity is wide open for Jews to assimilate and become part of the family of nations. But the truth is, we don't really want that. It's not that what happens is, what I think the psychology is this. At certain moments, we want to be treated by the other nations like a special nation, but we crave at other times the Jewish exceptionalism of what the state of Israel is supposed to be, which is why in the same email chain, you'll have somebody writing to you and saying, look how Israel is singled out by the UN, and the following email is, look how many Israeli Nobel Prize winners there are. And it signals, right, it's a banal example which signals the same psychological piece that we're trying to work out, which is the old story. Do we want to be a great story Or do we want to just be like everybody else? So I would say, all I'm saying to you, in that instinct, when you say to yourself, why are we holding ourselves to such a high standard? Ask yourself whether we ask the same question about shul, or about our children, or about any other thing in Judaism, where we do demand, well, if we're going to do something Jewishly, we have a whole book that tells us what it means to build a Jewish state. That's why we hold ourselves to a high standard, not because I'm trying to invalidate like the fact that Israel gets a bad rap in the UN, right? Fight that fight on that front, but we don't want to ever slip up on the basis of that to say, why do we have to make the state of Israel so much?
To really be a Jew in the world, we have to understand that there is some real threat to the ability for Israel to survive. So maybe we've got to really sort of put on the hat of the Auschwitz at the moment and realize that maybe that when someone says something, they really mean it. And I think that hope there's enough reality in the world that Iran means it.
Okay, so let me say two quick things on this. One is, paradoxically, we sold Israel to ourselves and to others for the past 60 years on the basis of two crises that if we believed both, they actually are working at odds with each other. One of them was support Israel because Israel is on the verge of attack and they need us paternalistically to help protect them in that moment, or protect Israel or give money to Israel because we someday are going to need a place to go to. If you actually believe both of those things at the same time, then you're really in trouble. But most likely, people play a game in their mind of it's either my city of refuge or the place that's about to be destroyed. Psychologically, that is a very damaging exercise in activity for the Jewish people. And I would say, moreover, it is increasingly, and again, it's not about Iran, it's not a referendum on Iran. Increasingly, it has been played so heavily and so overplayed that people don't believe it anymore. I remember when the unilateral Declaration of Independence came out in the UN. Remember that happened a couple years ago? My inbox was full of emails from American Jewish organizations saying, this is the existential crisis to the state of Israel. And usually it was followed up with, give money to this organization. Now, the more you say the phrase, it's an existential threat to the state of Israel, the less I believe in that you understand the meaning of the term existential threat. In other words, we've lost the ability in that game to actually it's the boy who cried wolf problem. So I'm not dismissing the possibility of great existential threats that face the Jewish people. It just can't be the entire animating mechanism of why we talk about our relationship to the state of Israel. The last thing I'll say is there's a big difference between saying that the lesson of the Holocaust is the moral obligation of the Jewish people to take these threats seriously, and that the legacy of Zionism is we can take care of it ourselves. There's a very big difference between that and saying the moral lesson of the Holocaust is that once again, look, we're being held vulnerable to the nations of the world. The ironic twist is that a Zionist response could use 1939 as a means of saying, what do we have to do as the Jewish people and the Jewish state to respond to this, which is very different than using that metaphor of look how we are being held out as victims anymore. The irony is some of the loudest voices that use the 1939 metaphor are being ironically anti-Zionist. Because they're basically pretending as though in the span of the time between 1939 and now, we didn't develop an incredible military. In other words, you have to be willing to say, right, someone who may oppose the U.S. intervening in Iran, you have to be willing as a Zionist to say, if the state of Israel perceives that it has a threat against itself, it has the right to defend itself. That's what Zionism allowed us to do. But that's different than saying Zionism has no impact and therefore it's 1939 all over again and once again we're victims in our history. The challenge here is to both hold on to a sense of victimhood and at the same time animate a sense of Zionism which enables us and allows us as Jewish people to shape our future.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.